BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello everybody, today is Wednesday, another Ripper Wednesday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? On Wednesdays this year I've been talking to you guys about Jack the Ripper, perhaps the world's most famous unsolved mystery. And in this episode I will be discussing the book Jack the Ripper, Victims and Suspects by Liam Dale. And this is a book that I've wanted to explore for quite some time now because on a recent episode of Ripper Wednesday, I discussed Liam Dale's other book, Jack the Ripper in the Footsteps of the Notorious Serial Killer, and I have a direct response to that one here on this channel, and it's under the name of The Footsteps of Jack the Ripper, and I also invite you to check out any of the other Jack the Ripper episodes if you're curious, and you can also hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps out the channel, and please drop something down below if you have something to say about Jack the Ripper or anything in the true crime world. This is a book that begins by doing some basic walkthroughs of the crime scenes, and it actually starts in the spring of 1888 with the murder of Emma Smith, then going into August of 1888 with the murder of Martha Tabram. They are referred to as pre-canonical victims, and Jack the Ripper's canonical events began on August 31st of 1888 with the murder of Polly Nichols, then on September 8th with the murder of Annie Chapman. Then there was the double event that took place on September 30th of 1888, which saw the deaths of Liz Stride and Catherine Eddowes, and then finally the murder of Mary Kelly on November 9th of that year. But this book will discuss some of the other victims that are possible or potential Ripper victims, and I will respond to them later in the episode. But I also want to look at what Liam Dale had to say about the suspects that were featured in this book, and he begins by talking about Joseph Barnett, and it was actually a very interesting revisit to a Jack the Ripper suspect named Joseph Barnett, whom I've spoken somewhat highly of in the past, or perhaps a better way of phrasing it is, I thought that there was a high chance that Joseph Barnett could be involved, because Joseph Barnett was the former lover of Mary Kelly, the final victim of Jack the Ripper. And I'm really glad that Liam Dale chose to differentiate the possibility of Joseph Barnett being a murder suspect with the whole elaborate theory that has been created for Joseph Barnett that, okay, Joseph Barnett was a lover of Mary Kelly, and she was working as a prostitute, and he was murdering other prostitutes because he wanted to scare her into leaving the profession. So he started murdering other women, and then maybe even writing the letters trying to make people think that he's some type of scary fiend named Jack the Ripper, and this is all done just to gain control of Mary Kelly, and when that didn't work, he savagely mutilated her. I do not like that theory. I've never liked that theory. But if you listen to my first episode on Joseph Barnett here on Ripper Wednesday, you'll see that I am quite curious about the connections that he had to a victim. I mean, yes, it is the concept of blame the ex-boyfriend, but when you explore true crime cases, there are reasons to suspect this person, or somebody in Mary Kelly's inner circle should come under suspicion. Now, some of the other points that are discussed in the book is, you don't have to simply attach yourself to that elaborate theory, which I think is making an enormous amount of assumptions, that Mary Kelly's ex-lover murdered 4 women previously, maybe even 6 women previously, because he's trying to brainwash her. How about just the fact that Joseph Barnett could have been a suspect for the murder of Mary Kelly? And that is where I think that the strongest connections are for Joseph Barnett in the Ripper case. And this is something that's rather similar to the theory that's put forward by the profiler Pat Brown, and if you watch her live stream on Jack the Ripper, she will lean toward a different suspect named Jacob Levy, and more or less she just says that he is her suspect, but that is only for the first 4 murders, the murders of Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Liz Stride, and Catherine Eddowes. Pat Brown believes that the murder of Mary Kelly was committed by somebody else, and the reason is that Mary Kelly was excessively mutilated, way more so than the other victims. And when I did the episode on Jacob Levy as a Ripper suspect, somebody challenged Pat Brown on that in the comment section here on Black Box Online Radio by saying, hey, now wait a second, Mary Kelly was murdered indoors and the other victims were murdered outdoors, like outside. Just because Mary Kelly was murdered inside and those victims were murdered outside, that doesn't really mean that there could be two separate killers. And I completely admit that, but that's not the heart and soul of the reason why Pat Brown and perhaps Liam Dale is considering is that there could have been a second killer. It is because of the excessive mutilations. And while this stuff isn't directly laid out in Liam Dale's book, what Pat Brown provided as the explanation for was that she believed that somebody was trying to recreate the actions of Jack the Ripper, or it was a copycat. Someone wanted to murder Mary Kelly, and they overdid it. They overdid the mutilations to an extreme form of overkill. And I've gone over a lot of the details in the murder of Mary Kelly over on the channel before, and they're very horrific things, so I don't want to list them off right now, but I invite you to check out some of my other episodes. And if you also want to hear some more biographical things about Mary Kelly, I invite you to listen to my two-part book discussion on the seduction of Mary Kelly by William J. Perring. Once again, I have 2 episodes on that book here on Black Box Online Radio. So what I think that Liam Dale did was he was looking at that theory from purely a form of consideration that Joseph Barnett could be a reasonable suspect for the murder of Mary Kelly, and it's all of those things that Pat Brown was talking about. He murdered her, but he was trying to pass it off as a Ripper crime, but he overly did the mutilations to the point where her body was cut up beyond recognition. And this is an interesting detail that is included in Liam Dale's book, and that is that Mary Kelly's heart was cut out and removed. And this is something that people might think about very metaphorically, and you can even see it on the cover of the book, Jack the Ripper, A True Love Story by Win Weston Davies, when it says that she took his heart, so he took hers, something to that effect. And, I mean, I can comprehend that. I don't necessarily know if that would be a typical thought process that would be put forward by somebody like Joseph Barnett if he were murdering his ex-lover. But the thing that was discussed in the book is there are these stories of Jack the Ripper murdering the victims, and with Annie Chapman and Catherine Eddowes, they have their organs cut out and taken, like the uterus and the kidney. The kidney, of course, was possibly mailed in with the From Hell letter, half the kidney anyway, the From Hell letter that was mailed to George Lusk. So what they're proposing, what Liam Dale was discussing in the book, Jack the Ripper, Victims and Suspects, is that somebody like Joseph Barnett heard the stories about Jack the Ripper cutting out organs, so he overly eviscerated Mary Kelly's body and stole the heart in an act of a symbolic gesture. Now, you guys maybe have heard me say this before on Ripper Wednesday, but I used to think very highly of Joseph Barnett as a Ripper suspect. I mean, so much of this made sense. Not the whole full package theory about he's trying to scare Mary Kelly into submission, but just the concept of him committing the murders and then ultimately making Mary Kelly the most vicious murderer for all of the reasons that I've listed off. But I just did not necessarily believe that he would have had the ability to fool all of the police officers when he identified the body, because Joseph Barnett is the person who identified Mary Kelly's body, and all of this is discussed in Liam Dale's book, Victims and Suspects, because, I mean, if he is the person who is being confronted by all of those officers, I mean, he must have been putting on one convincing Oscar-worthy or BAFTA-worthy acting performance to make them not suspect him, or at the very least not put him closer into being arrested in some ways. And Joseph Barnett was not exactly the most intellectual person. He worked as a fishmonger, and he would have been very good with a knife and handling fish organs anyway. I don't know about human organs, but that really had to kind of allow me to come down from my cloud for a particular second. You can drop what you think about Joseph Barnett as a Jack the Ripper suspect, but really, I want to know what you think about this copycat theory, because this is an aspect of Joseph Barnett's place in the story that I don't think I've discussed a lot on the channel. I mean, I've looked at him as a suspect in the murder of Mary Kelly in the past, but not exactly this copycat theory, because what I think Liam Dale said in the book really complements what Pat Brown said about how she believes that there was one person who committed the first 4 murders and the final murder was committed by Joseph Barnett. I would love to know what you guys think. You can put your ideas in the comments section down below. I mean, just participate in the discussion, share anything you would like about Joseph Barnett as a Ripper suspect. Another suspect that was discussed in the book was Severin Klasowski, who is also known as George Chapman. He was originally from Poland, and he studied in Russia. He had medical knowledge, he worked as a barber, but George Chapman goes on to become a figure in true crime history on its own, and he is known as the Burrow Poisoner. And the thing that Liam Dale shared in his book, Victims and Suspects, is he looks at how George Chapman was thought to have been Jack the Ripper by Frederick George Aberline, and he even made the statement that this person, George Chapman, was arrested and convicted for murdering his wives by poisoning. And this is an instance where if somebody is going to slowly poison his own wives to the point where he's just sitting back and watching them die, not quickly but slowly, then there's a much bigger reason to suspect him in other cases, such as that of being Jack the Ripper. And I did one episode about George Chapman as Jack the Ripper suspect here on Black Box Online Radio. I have a suspect playlist, but I was very dismissive of him as a suspect. I was playing the superficial card of, hey, wait a second, the Ripper mutilated and disemboweled women. Think about everything I said about cutting out organs and possibly mailing them in with the From Hell letter and so on, and poisoning. That's such a milder form of criminal behavior. And I had somewhat of a reversal about this when I was watching the episode of the Citizen Detective podcast where they were discussing Jack the Ripper. It's the final episode of the Citizen Detective podcast. And Dr. Lee Meller said that he had a very similar experience. He is a criminologist. And he said that he first looked at George Chapman as a Jack the Ripper suspect and thought, absolutely not, there's no way this guy could be Jack the Ripper. Because going from mutilating women to poisoning women, that is just such a bizarre change, right? But he said in his criminological experience, it is not uncommon for serial killers to alter their behaviors when they're committing crimes in different ways for different reasons. And I'd always wondered why people were looking at George Chapman so closely as a Jack the Ripper suspect, and perhaps there is a certain degree of there's a certain amount of reasons why people would indeed suspect him, and I do think very highly of Dr. Lee Meller and the way that he is able to analyze these facts. And I have a larger episode where I discuss this in more detail called The Zodiac and Jack the Ripper Last Blood, which is actually a live stream that I did for the older True Crime Talk Radio in the Morning segment here on Black Box Online Radio. Now, there is another suspect that has been discussed in this book, Victims and Suspects by Liam Dale, and his name is Montague John Druitt, and he is more or less listed as the prime suspect. Liam Dale refers to Montague John Druitt as the prime suspect in the Jack the Ripper case, and part of me wants to do a much larger presentation on Montague John Druitt as a Jack the Ripper suspect, because I think that he has just been unfairly vilified, and I would like to go through all of the claims and all of the evidence that people have, and I'm going to try my best to do it with an honest approach, because I feel that so much of this centers on the McNaughton Memorandum that was written in 1894, where Melville McNaughton was responding to an article from a publication called The Sun that said Jack the Ripper had been named as Thomas Cutbush, so he provided three other suspects, Montague John Druitt, Aaron Kosminski, possibly, and then the third one was Michael Ostrog. And I'm going to go out on a limb here, and maybe I am completely wrong for saying this, but I don't really care what Melville McNaughton thought about any of these suspects for the following reasons. Michael Ostrog was incarcerated in France at the time of the Ripper murders, so to even think that he's a strong suspect is already going against this guy's credibility. So to say that Montague John Druitt should be the prime suspect, he was a barrister and he worked at a school and he committed suicide shortly after the murders. And I think so many people are just zoning in on this convenient analyses of the timeline that, okay, well, it had to be this guy because the Ripper murders stopped. Well, we aren't even completely sure if the Ripper murders stopped because, as I said, this book is called Jack the Ripper Victims and Suspects by Liam Dale. And it begins with Emma Smith goes to Martha Tavern, then there's the Canonical Five, and then Liam Dale does discuss the murder of Rose Milett on December 20th of 1888, where Montague John Druitt should have passed away, and then there's the murder of Alice Mackenzie in 1889 and the murder of Frances Coles in 1891. And to anybody who is thinking that Montague John Druitt is and was Jack the Ripper, but they also think that there could be some type of connection to the post-canonical crimes, that wouldn't work out. And people who think that any of those murders that I just listed off, Rose Milett, Alice Mackenzie, and Frances Coles, if they think that those crimes were committed by Jack the Ripper, then Montague John Druitt would also not be your suspect. And part of me feels like I would be going into that suspect investigation with a certain amount of biases where I don't necessarily want to just completely debunk the situation. I've done that before on Black Box Online Radio, and I found that, it's not the most practical approach to just say that you're trying to debunk someone's information. As somebody once said during an investigation show, you should be investigating. It should be about getting the truth, not simply about trying to prove somebody else wrong. But I just think that to call Montague John Druitt and to look at the evidence, you really find out that the evidence is very flimsy for him being Jack the Ripper, but there are books that have been written about him, and I would gladly explore some of them on Ripper Wednesday. Now, I've discussed some of these suspects before on this channel, but there is one story that I have not mentioned before, and it is discussed in Liam Dale's book, because it's also asking the question of, why would Jack the Ripper suddenly stop killing after the murder of Mary Kelly? And some people simply do not believe that he did. For example, there is the attack on Annie Farmer that took place on November 21st of 1888. And this is something that I have not discussed before on Ripper Wednesday. So I would like to go over to an article that was written and published on Jack the Ripper Tour, written by Richard Jones. And if you want to reference anything, I encourage you to go to his website. Richard Jones really has done a great job sharing free resources for people to read and listen to on the internet. And let's have a read about the attack on Annie Farmer. On November 21st of 1888, with the East End still reeling from the shock and the murder of Mary Kelly, which had taken place earlier in the month, news broke of another attack on a woman named Annie Farmer, which caused the press to ponder if Jack the Ripper had struck again. Attempt to murder a woman. In its November 21st, 1888 issue of the St. James Gazette, they provided the readers with a brief synopsis of the facts. There were London tragedies against more women in Whitechapel. An attempt to murder a woman in Whitechapel. Great excitement was caused in the Spitalfields this morning by a report that another murder of a woman had been discovered at about 10 o'clock at 19 George Street, running up from Flower to Dean Street, thralling, and the report stated that it was much exaggerated, though the facts show that murder was attempted. And as I understand everything here is that Annie Farmer was not murdered, and that's even discussed in Liam Dale's book, Victims and Suspects, stating that Annie Farmer was actually able to live and give her own account of what happened. At about 8 o'clock in the morning, a man and a woman named Farmer, that would be Annie Farmer, engaged a bed at the commercial lodging house at 19 George Street. About 9:30, screams were heard, and a man ran out to Commercial Street to the station. After the wound was dressed, she gave a description of her assailant as follows. As I said, she provided the description, so this is an attempted murder. Age 30, height 5 feet 6 inches tall, fair complexion, mustache. He wore a black diagonal coat and a hard felt hat, and he is said to be known, and his capture is confidentially anticipated by the police. Okay, that is from the St. James Gazette in November of 1888. So some people might simply be thinking that, okay, this whole thing about Jack the Ripper didn't act again after the murder of Mary Kelly, that could be completely bogus. He could have attacked Annie Farmer. And there are some reasons to suspect that. Firstly, this really matches the description that was provided by George Hutchinson, a witness to the murder of Mary Kelly, or a witness to seeing a man walking with Mary Kelly shortly before her murder. Let's be clear about that. But he was also estimated to have been 5 feet 6 inches tall, in his 30s. I think that George Hutchinson actually stated that he was around 35 or 36 years old, just going off of memory. But when you look at a lot of the other descriptions of men in the area around the other Ripper crimes, they're looking at somebody who is in their early 30s. Sometimes you'll see things like late 20s. Sometimes you'll see something like 25, but around 5 feet 5 inches tall, 5 feet 6 inches tall. This is all matching up. The mustache as well, and the black coat. I think that this is something that is that is definitely worthy of consideration when you look at the time frame, because this would show that perhaps the Ripper murdered Mary Kelly and he got away with it. She was murdered indoors, so he had at least 2 hours to spend with her body. He had perhaps even more time to spend with her body. And in one of the Jack the Ripper documentaries, they were talking about one of the reasons why Mary Kelly was murdered so viciously, and is that most of the mutilations took place post mortem, and that she was already dead, so she wouldn't have suffered through them in a torturous way. But after the 2 hours that had taken place where the Ripper was cutting her apart, rigor mortis perhaps set in, and it became more difficult to do so. So that's why he left. Now, this thing about the copycat is a very hard angle to it's a hard angle to present to me, and I've said it's an uphill battle if you're going to convince me that there was one killer who did the first four crimes and then Mary Kelly was murdered by a copycat. If you're going to include a suspect like Joseph Barnett, I'm going to be a little bit more open to that because of the reasons, but I've also expressed the points where I would have doubts about Joseph Barnett committing the murder of Mary Kelly. But so the Ripper commits this horribly vicious murder, and then about, let's see, 2 weeks later, November 9th to November 21st, you have the attack on Annie Farmer, and then he's trying to commit another murder of a woman, and he's unsuccessful at doing so. I mean, so then he's just like, okay, wow, I'm going to get caught if I keep doing this. I thought I was on top of the world. I thought I was untouchable, but the victim got away this time. Is that something that scared the Ripper into silence? That is also something that is worthy of consideration. And one more time, I mean, I read about this story in Liam Dale's book, Victims and Suspects. You can also read more about it on Jack the Ripper Tour, as well as a lot of the other Jack the Ripper websites. Even casebook.org has an article on the attack on Annie Farmer. Okay, though, now we're going to be looking at some other aspects that are discussed in Liam Dale's book, Jack the Ripper, Victims and Suspects. And one of them is how things would have taken place with the activities and actions of the victims. If we want to start with August 31st of 1888, we have the murder of Polly Nichols. And one thing that is discussed very frequently in all the accounts of Polly Nichols' last day alive is that she had earned her money to pay for her lodging house, which was called the Doss money, 2 or 3 times over, and then she left, and she said she was confident that she could get it again. And this is definitely disputed by someone like Holly Rubenhold, who is the author of The Five, when she says that people hear that, and they just immediately think that she was working as a prostitute, and that there is no reason to think that she was actually going out to prostitute herself in any way. And I know that this might not be the most historically sensitive thing for me to say, but I'm not necessarily concerned with that fact, because the thesis statement of the book, The Five, is that the women who were murdered by Jack the Ripper may not have all been prostitutes. In fact, it's often misrepresented that none of them were working as sex workers or ladies of the night, but in all reality it states that there were 3 of them that most likely were not. Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, and Catherine Eddowes were not working as prostitutes. Liz Stride did occasionally, but she was not working on the night of her murder. And Hallie Rubenfeld does concede that Mary Kelly was murdered by while she was working as a prostitute. And I'm just simply saying that no matter what these women were doing, no matter what reason they were out on the streets, they didn't deserve to be murdered, they didn't deserve to be mutilated, they didn't deserve to be disemboweled, and they didn't deserve to have their organs cut out. So, I mean, you can talk about some of the historical details, but I don't necessarily concern myself too much with those, because I think it's still the same conclusion at the end of the day. Well, who was responsible for the murders? And I wouldn't think more highly or lesser of the women for anything that happened to them that night based on their occupations alone. I mean, other than extreme exceptions. So that is something that is brought up in Liam Dale's book, Victims and Suspects, and that's why I'm addressing it with you guys here. And then there, of course, would be the murder of Annie Chapman that would happen roughly 7 or 8 days later on September 8th. Then there's something that's very interesting in Liam Dale's book when he talks about the double event that occurred on September 30th of 1888. And firstly, he tells the story of Liz Stride and how there is a claim that the women who were murdered by Jack the Ripper may have been specifically targeted, and that there were specific plans to choose these women, and that maybe the Ripper is going after them and for reasons, and also that there could be cases of mistaken identity, that they were trying to murder Mary Kelly and they mistook Liz Stride or Catherine Eddowes for Mary Kelly. I think that that would be very hard to do because they were considerably older. And last week on the channel, I was talking to you guys about the Jack the Ripper suspect Samuel Friedman, and he is the suspect of Randy Williams for the murder of Catherine Eddowes. And Randy Williams believes that there were three killers: Samuel Friedman, Isaac Kosabrodsky, and Louis Diemschutz. And one thing that was discussed in Randy Williams's interviews that he has done is that he even said this once, and I'm hoping that it's done in jest, when he said that he thought people would have been luring Liz Stride to them by offering her grapes, saying, "Hey, little girl, want some grapes?" Because there is a story of her having grapes in her hand on the night of her murder, and Liz Stride would have been in her mid-40s at the time, so she certainly wouldn't have passed for being a little girl, if you understand my meaning. And I think Randy Williams is aware of that. He knows the case inside and out. I think that that statement was done in a form of hyperbole, but I just wanted to share it all the same. So then there's the murder of Liz Stride, and then very shortly after that, that's the murder of Catherine Eddowes, and there are two women that are murdered in one night. And then what I thought was most interesting from that story is what Liam Dale had to say about the Goulston Street graffito, which was written after the murder of Catherine Eddowes, of course on a building in Goulston Street, and it says something to the effect of, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." And this is one where it is, well, the story that's shared in the book, Jack the Ripper, Victims and Suspects, is that multiple people had the opportunity to observe this. I mean, it may have been written as late as 2:59 in the morning on September 30th of 1888, and they could not photograph it because it was too dark and that the 1888 photo technology wouldn't have permitted that. So they had to wait until sunrise to photograph the Goulston Street graffito, but it was after 5 a.m. on September 30th that Sir Charles Warren ordered the Goulston Street graffito to be erased because he didn't want it to incite any type of riot involving the Jewish people, whether for or against, but he didn't want a riot to take place. But this means, though, that people would have been looking at the Goulston Street graffito for at least 2 hours, so they should have had a pretty solid opportunity to transcribe it. There are so many things that people say about it, about how the words could be phrased. The Jews are not the men that will be blamed for nothing. The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing. But what I think most important to note is that the word Jews is spelled Juews. It is misspelled, or Jeuws. As I said, it hasn't been photographed, but it should have been transcribed properly, and then we can perhaps get the technicalities of that for a future episode. But what is really interesting is that Liam Dale asks a question to the readers of his book, Jack the Ripper, Victims and Suspects, and that is, what kind of person could have murdered Catherine Eddowes and then written a message on a wall in chalk that was legible enough to people read? Not only murdering Catherine Eddowes, but mutilating her, and also committing two murders in one night. I mean, this is the night of the double event. What kind of person could have just written a calmly legible message on a building? I have a very simple answer for that. Someone with psychopathic or sociopathic tendencies. Someone who was a clinical psychopath or sociopath would have been able to do that, because I always go back to the first video that I ever watched on this subject, which was done by the YouTube psychologist Dr. Ramani, and she isn't the most credible person anymore, but what she said is just that when you hear stories of psychopathic serial killers, they're the type of people that could have a dead body in the trunk of their car, and then they could just have a conversation with someone, like they could go through a checkpoint and look at a police officer. "Hi, officer, how's your evening going?" And they're not going to show anything that is going to suspect people. They're not going to show any signs of guilt. They're not going to show any particular type of reason to suspect them. So I guess that goes back to Joseph Barnett a little bit. Maybe if he were indeed a clinical psychopath or sociopath, he could have fooled the authorities with an acting job if he did indeed murder Mary Kelly. But, I mean, that's kind of based on, number one, the assumption that he was a psychopath, number two, the assumption that he did commit the murder, and the third assumption would be that he actually was able to do that without giving away any other additional information aside from his body language and his mannerisms and his facial expressions. I mean, we're talking about things like giving away clues when he was interrogated, which he was, and this is how they actually had obtained the information that he had echolalia, where he would repeat verbiage that was spoken back to him in almost a speech impediment-like way, but echolalia is a little bit different. And notice I said like an impediment, but not an impediment. All right, so I mean, this is just something, though, about writing the Goulston Street graffito. Yes, if someone had sociopathic tendencies, they would just look around, see that nobody is present, and they could have written the message themselves. So that is, I think that my biggest takeaway from this book here, Jack the Ripper, Victims and Suspects. I wanted to respond to that challenge question, and perhaps I can do a larger presentation in the future on the murder of Annie Farmer, as well as some of the other stories, because we didn't even discuss all of the victims in this episode, like Emily Horsnell and Fairy Faye, and overall, though, I'm going to give you guys my honest take on the subject, because I rarely hold back what I think here on Black Box Online Radio. As of now, even though I've entertained this possibility with multiple killers, I still have to say that I think Mary Kelly was murdered by the same person who committed the murders of Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Liz Stride, and Catherine Eddowes. Yeah, I'm always going to consider someone's theory if it's done in a reasonable way, and I think there's an 80% chance that Martha Tabram was murdered by Jack the Ripper. And as I said, I spoke very highly of Dr. Lee Meller. When he was on the Citizen Detective podcast talking about this case, he said that the canonical 5 should actually be the canonical 6, that Martha Tabram, who was stabbed 39 times on August 7th of 1888, was actually murdered by Jack the Ripper. I mean, there are a lot of reasons to suspect that. With Emma Smith, nothing against her. I mean, she didn't deserve to be murdered either, but I think there's a 10% chance that she was actually murdered by the Ripper. And as far as this attack on Annie Farmer goes, I am definitely open to the possibility. I would have to reserve some type of rating until I can learn more about the story, but I mean, this seems like this has a lot of hallmarks of the Ripper case. But one point that I bring up over and over again on these Ripper Wednesday segments is there is this belief out there that murder was not a common occurrence in Whitechapel. I don't think so. I mean, all I'm doing is encountering more and more stories of how people were murdered, or also attacks and attempted murders and suspicious deaths. Like, say, for example, the death of Annie Millwood might not have even been a murder, but it's a suspicious death that took place in 1888. And then we also have stories like of Ada Wilson and now Annie Farmer. So it appears that there are a lot more homicides and violent crimes than what the superficial Jack the Ripper sources would try to present. They just make it seem like, yeah, Whitechapel was poor, but murder was not a common occurrence. That's why people focus so much on Jack the Ripper. I also think that people focused on Jack the Ripper because of the newspapers, because of the moniker or pseudonym that was created, because of the persona that was created. And another thing that I also encountered was that it's not just the name itself. Even prior to the announcement of Jack the Ripper, these crimes were widely reported on, even before the murder of Polly Nichols. After the murder of Martha Tabram, a vigilance committee was also formed. So this is just going to show that people really understood the situations, and that maybe they thought that murder was not the most common occurrence in the world, but it's definitely more frequent than what has been originally reported, and these crimes were widely discussed, and it spread fear and panic, and by the time you get to September 30th of 1888, it's just like full-blown Ripper mania, and I just think it's a combination of all of these factors coming together at once. But I would love to know what you guys think about why the story of Jack the Ripper is more popular than other homicide cases. And as I said from the beginning of this segment, it is perhaps the most famous unsolved mystery in the entire world. And I'm just going to leave you guys with some of these things. What do you think about some of the suspects that were discussed in this book? Montague, John Druitt, Severin Klasovsky, also known as George Chapman, and Joseph Barnett. What do you think about some of the unconfirmed attacks and victims, like such as Martha Tabram, Emma Smith, and Annie Farmer? And really, I want to know what you guys think about this copycat theory that Joseph Barnett murdered Mary Kelly and that the other 4 crimes were committed by somebody else. Please give your feedback in the comment section down below. And, why is that right? Why is that wrong? And all of the stuff I said about Pat Brown came from a different episode. It just happened to be somewhat in sync with Liam Dale's book. And one more time, the name of the first episode that I did responding to Liam Dale's other Jack the Ripper book is called The Footsteps of Jack the Ripper. That is all for me now. I am your host, Black Box Ned, and you can write this show at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook name is Ned DeHaan, and I also have a page for Black Box Online Radio on Facebook. You can download this show for free on Spotify and Apple Podcasts under the names Black Box True Crime or Black Box Podcast. And there is always Black Box Ned 88 over on Instagram. BlackBoxNed88 is also the name of the BuyMeACoffee.com page. If you want to support this channel, you can use BuyMeACoffee.com/BlackBoxNed88, and anyone who makes a donation or contribution to help support the show will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. And I will see you on Friday talking about D.B. Cooper Friday here on Black Box Online Radio. Until next time.